Tonight's speaker is Tim Krause. Tim is in the Computing and New Media Technology Department. He's an assistant professor and teaches web design and programming courses. Tim holds a bachelor's degree in accounting from St. John's University in Minnesota, a master's in English from St. Cloud State University, also in Minnesota, and a PhD in English from Purdue in 2008. And I won't hold that against you, because I'm an Indiana grad, so. His dissertation research involved developing a method for managing large-scale web design and redesign projects that was based on Lean Six Sigma methodologies used most typically in manufacturing environments. In addition to publishing on that topic, Tim is also working with his colleague on bringing mobile application development to the curriculum, and recently presented the work at a conference called STEM Tech, a national conference that focuses on trends in science and technology. Tim and his wife Kim came to Stevens Point area in 2005 after working for a variety of .coms and a large privately held company in Minneapolis. Tim grew up in Chippewa Falls, and he asked me to tell you that, of course, Chippewa Falls being known for Leinenkugel, he grew up apparently about a block away, so that will explain some of his idiosyncrasies. He and his wife are avid runners and cyclists, and as I like to say, if you remember the Beatitudes, I think they had in the Beatitudes, Jesus said something along the lines of, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Maybe I got that wrong. but Tim and his wife are also cheesemakers, so blessed be the cheesemakers, as they say. And they make, what is it, Gouda?
Gorgonzola, cheddar, mozzarella.
Yes, a man after my own heart. Tim's topic tonight is removing classroom walls, university-community partnerships. And I asked Tim to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of questions from the audience, and then I'll come up, dismiss everyone, and you can ask questions informally up here. Okay? So, Tim Krause, it's all yours.
Chris, thanks.
I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. If not, just give a wave or something, and I'll do my best to speak up. The plan for this evening, I intend for this to be relatively informal and want to use it as an opportunity to talk about a variety of projects that my students have worked on here on campus over the past 5 or 6 years. I want to start a little bit with some background and an overview of community-based projects and kind of talk a little bit about how I came to this particular approach and how we approach the work that we do in the community. I want to spend the lion's share of our time really just sharing and talking about sample projects in terms of the type of work that students have been doing in and around Stevens Point and central Wisconsin. And also, for those that are interested, want to talk a little bit about lessons learned. As someone who's been trained and worked as a project manager, what I can tell you, and we'll talk about this with respect to some of the examples, is that managing these projects has proven to be more difficult and challenging than manage large corporate projects. The dynamic is just very, very different, and it requires, I think, a slightly different skill set than what I would have typically expected. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then for those of you who may be here because you're interested in working with students in some capacity, we'll talk a little bit about how to get started. And I think in that respect, not just with my students potentially, but I'm very, very fortunate to have a number of colleagues on campus in a variety of departments who practice a similar approach in their classrooms as well. So we'll talk about briefly some of the things that they do that I think is really interesting. So in terms of my background and interest in project-based learning and in getting students out in the community, I actually started and ran my first projects way back in 1995 when I was a graduate student at Purdue. And really not an idea of my own, but I was fortunate enough to have a faculty advisor, Jim Porter, who taught business writing, and we really thought that it was important to connect students through writing with members of the community and help them solve real-world problems through writing and communication. So Jim really taught me an awful lot about what I know and about how I practice these types of projects. So really part of the business writing course to begin with. And that's where I got my start. The real key there was, with those local businesses, with organizations that we had connections with. And I'll kind of circle back to that local businesses piece of this in just a minute. One of the things that I think we discovered was that, and this is where I think these projects can be more difficult than project work in a business setting. We have no budget. So one of the challenges is we're going to solve real problems, but we don't have any money to do it. If that's not complicated enough, my experience in the workplace is, if a project's taking a little bit longer to complete, you go to your supervisor, you explain the situation, and you say, I think I can still do this, but I need an extra week. That's not how it works on campus. The semester ends, and when the semester ends, these guys go away, and the project either needs to be done, or if it's not, we don't deliver on our promise. And as you can probably imagine, if we consistently fail to deliver on that promise, we don't get opportunities to continue to do that work. So our reputation is very much at stake. So that provides, I think, some really unique challenges in terms of how we're structuring projects to make sure that we can complete them successfully and on time. What I discovered then, and so kind of first lesson, was this interesting pattern that didn't always hold to be 100% true, but oftentimes if we were working with a local business, they were thinking about projects the way a business person would think about projects. And so, if it took a little while to get back to us with information, it really wasn't a big deal. It wasn't terribly urgent. If things were going to take a little bit longer, again, not a lot of urgency there. And in many cases, those businesses also had resources that they could apply to solving the problem if we weren't successful. So in terms of really holding our feet to the fire to ensure that we were going to deliver something that was going to work for them, it was sort of it's students. If you're successful, that's fantastic. And if you're not, we can solve the problem another way. Contrast that with smaller businesses, or especially with local nonprofits. Most of the groups that we work with and I work with here in Stevens Point are coming to us because they have very small operating budgets to begin with. They know that they have the need for a website, a DVD, for doing some social networking with their donor base, for example, but they don't necessarily have the budget to do that, or in some cases may or may not have the expertise to do it. So we kind of at that point become sort of the only game in town in terms of the options that are available. That adds an interesting shift to the dynamic in terms of how we work together, because I'm not only driving on our side of the project students to be successful so that they have real work to show when they go out and interview for full-time opportunities, but they're also having some very real pressure placed on them from that nonprofit, because that organization also wants to make sure that what's delivered to them is something that's going to work. So we found in that sense that those community partners have been some of our absolute best partners. There's a side benefit as well, I think, and this stems from some of my own background and experience. When Kim and I moved here from Minneapolis, we were extremely frustrated by the fact that we lived in this really large town with lots of rich opportunities in terms of art and culture, but for as much as we wanted to be involved and engaged in our local communities, in local government, we were really small fish in a really big pond, and those opportunities just weren't there. And so our hope in moving to central Wisconsin was that we were going to be able to not just be successful professionals, but able to actively give back and contribute in the community. And we've had some fabulous opportunities to do that, by the way. What I've discovered is it's those types of experiences that are richly rewarding. And when we think about our students and what they're going to do when they graduate from college, granted, many of them, like Drew, who's in the front row, want to stay in the area if there's an opportunity available. We do have some students where, it's a little bit more of an open book in terms of, what they want to do next. And connecting those students with nonprofit organizations, helping to invest them in the community in a meaningful way, has been really, truly remarkable in terms of their desire to want to stay afterwards because they've got additional reasons to want to stay. And that's something that's struck me for a number of years because I think back to my own experiences as a high schooler and some of the things that the community tried to do to persuade me to come back to Chippewa Falls. And as you can tell, I didn't go back to Chippewa Falls when I graduated. I think that this provides a different model in terms of thinking about how we keep younger adults coming back to and investing in their hometowns, which I think is also an advantage. So in terms of the partnerships themselves, what does this look? What does it look like? I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of different ways that these partnerships have played out in terms of my experiences, and also suggest that there are lots of other ways that this could look and work. So this isn't intended by any means to be sort of a one-size-fits-all. In a typical semester, and my colleague Professor Gibbs, who's in the back row in the corner, has participated in some of these projects as well, and so should be recognized for that. Together this semester, we're running 9 projects. Some of them are with community-based nonprofit organizations. We have some that look more like traditional internships. So there's a little bit of a mix this semester. In this particular model, we're working with seniors. It's typically their last semester, and we want them to have a significant experience developing a computer application, a website, a multimedia project. So they enroll in a 4-credit course. We identify a partner organization for them, and literally all we do the entire semester is work on those projects. So when we typically think about 4-credit courses and the amount of homework that would get done, in theory, because I know this probably isn't the case, we end up getting at a number that runs at plus or minus 300 hours of work per student, and we often assign 2, 3, or 4 students to a project. What I can tell you is that if you have a project that is going to require 4 students to complete, 1,200 hours of work is a really, really nice number in terms of what we can accomplish with that amount of time. And in terms of what that allows that group to then demonstrate at the completion of the class is really quite remarkable for them as well when they're talking to an employer, and allows them to say, this wasn't a typical class. We didn't just read about this. We didn't just theorize about it. We didn't do a simulation in class. We worked with a real client. It also means that in addition to my being able to advocate for them in terms of a job reference, they now have someone else in the community, because I can't tell you the number of times that I've gotten phone calls from employers who have said, oh, you're a professor? Well, I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to an employer. And I have been able to talk some employers into talking to me anyway because of these projects, but they have very distinct perceptions of how things operate, whether they're correct or not. But if we can direct them back to a member in the community who oftentimes they know, that's an even stronger reference and recommendation for the student. And so if they have some misperceptions about what's going on in the classroom, I'm willing to put up with some of that in exchange for that kind of reference for them. So that's one approach that we take, and currently all of the community projects that I'm managing this semester follow that model. And we'll look at some examples in just a couple minutes. I do also on occasion have the pleasure of being able to teach our first and second year students, and I do like the notion of getting them engaged and involved in the community as early as possible as well. Typically in those courses though, we have lots of content that we have to cover, and lots of work to bring those students up to the point where they're ready for that capstone course. So we can work on community-based projects, but we structure them a little bit differently and use our time a little bit more traditionally, I guess, in those particular classrooms. So in these cases, we're talking smaller projects. Typically, I let students know what options and opportunities are available by the second week of class, so after they've settled in a little bit, and suggest that over the course of the semester, and based upon their schedule and their interest, that they're going to be spending somewhere between 10 and 20 hours with a local organization providing some kind of assistance that's related to technology. Okay, so the technology piece for me is important, sure, in part because of the department that I'm teaching in, but partly because, with present company excluded, of course, some of us who are really interested and focused on technology are sometimes a little introverted. Again, not true of the front row. We sometimes struggle trying to figure out how do we take very complex technical terminology and issues and concepts and explain them in a way that someone with early onset dementia is going to understand so that he can download pictures, for example, from the web. And so I'm hoping to connect students in this class to organizations in the community as well. It happens in a smaller way, but it helps to build a habit of mind in terms of what we're going to ask them to do in the larger capstone experience their senior year. But it also helps in a very real way the students develop some really strong communication skills in terms of how they talk to non-technical folks about very technical items. And at the same time, they're providing a distinct service in terms of building really basic websites, which you can do in about 10 to 20 hours, of sitting with a senior at the Lincoln Center and helping with email or downloading photos, of managing the computer lab at Oak Ridge Assisted Living Facility. And in some cases, because with some first and second year students, we discover that we may not be in quite the right place in terms of what we want to major in and where we see ourselves going professionally. So I've also had some students who have really taken an interest in writing and other forms of communication, and so for them, they've had the opportunity to go in with an MP3 recorder and talk to seniors about their childhood and basically collect oral history that they can then edit and share back with the family. And oftentimes absolutely amazing in terms of how students like Chris, for example, were able to get some of the women she was working with to really open up and talk about what it was like to grow up during the Depression. And to tell stories that we learned later were stories that the family didn't know, that the family hadn't captured, and that would have otherwise been lost. So I think some real value as well there. With these projects in particular, one of the main things that we tend to hear in terms of feedback is literally just the connection that college students who are away from home for the first time are making with folks who are their grandparents' age and the value that they have in that relationship, and vice versa from grandparents who oftentimes don't see their grandchildren as often as they would like to, that are still able to make some connections with some very vibrant young adults as well. So I think really enriching from both perspectives. I do want to acknowledge at this point, so at a very high level, those are the two primary ways that I tend to think about service and the work that we do in the community. I have some wonderful colleagues in the English department, in psychology, in philosophy, colleagues in the College of Professional Services who also make service a part of the work that they do in the community. Gina Magyar-Mo from psychology is very active in talking to her colleagues about incorporating this kind of work into